Welcome back. We are going to finish up talking about cell basics, and we're going to focus on two types of cells that are most important that you guys can tell the difference between. The big idea, again, is to describe cellular structures that are used to carry out specific functions for the organism. And like I said, we'll talk about transport specifically later. And the learning targets that we're going to focus on for this one is to draw a diagram of a cell and name each of its parts. So we're going to be focusing on two particular cell types in order to identify those diagrams. Okay, we're going to talk about different types of cells, but no matter what kind of cell we talk about, all cells have these four basic structures. They all have a cell membrane. The cell membrane is often also called the plasma membrane, and it's basically the border and the surface area for the cell. It keeps everything that's supposed to be in the cell in and everything that's not out. Anytime something has to cross the border, it has to get permission, unless it's special. All right, cytoplasm is the gel-like substance inside. If you think about it like a water balloon again, it would be the equivalent of the water, except it's gel. It's water-based, but it's thicker than that. It gives the cells its structure. Also, ribosomes are a very special player. You know that proteins are very important to cellular processes, and ribosomes are what makes proteins. DNA is the last one to talk about, and I want to make sure that I stress here that when I say DNA, I'm not necessarily meaning there's always a nucleus, but the DNA carries the directions for what the ribosomes are going to make and what those proteins are going to become. And so every cell, whether or not it has a nucleus, has to have DNA. All right, so on the note of a nucleus or not, there are two different basic types of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotes have no nucleus. So prokaryotes have no nucleus. Eukaryotes, like you are a eukaryote. All of your cells have a nucleus. So when you look at this bacterial cell, which is another word for prokaryote, another type of a prokaryote, you'll see that there is nothing holding that DNA together. But if you look over at the animal cell, the animal cell has this structure in the middle, which inside is where you'd find the DNA. Because look how complicated the animal cell is, or even a plant cell. But this is a eukaryotic cell. It's very complicated on the inside. If the DNA were just to be allowed to be freely floating throughout this complicated structure, you'd get a lot of mistakes made in the copying of DNA, which is what has to happen when you're going to replicate. This structure is very simple, and it has no need to contain the DNA. It's just this and some ribosomes, and that's really all that's on the inside. A couple of other small organelles. So what do you need to remember? Pro is no nucleus. Pro is no. And you have nuclei. So here it is, all summarized for you so that you can snip it or copy it. I suggest that you pause the video and make sure you have these written down. Now that you've had a chance to pause the video, I'm going to move along here and talk about a visual of prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. I like these little illustrations. I think that they're helpful in remembering. If you can remember what a picture looked like, you can sometimes remember better what you were supposed to keep in mind for your test. So cells are either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Prokaryotic cells are bacteria. Eukaryotic cells are mostly multicellular, not all of them. Animals, plants, and fungi are all eukaryotes. Oh my gosh, sorry. This little illustration up here shows you that prokaryotes, pro rhymes with no, both of them have a cell membrane, both of them have DNA, both of them have ribosomes. Eukaryotes rhymes with do because they have things that do things on the inside. Feel free to pause the video and snip these or whatever you want to do. They're pretty cute. All right, eukaryotic cells. Let's just look at eukaryotic cells alone for a minute. All eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, and that's where the DNA is held. They all have ribosomes where proteins are made, and they all have something called a cytoskeleton, and that helps give the cell its shape. So there are other ones we're going to come talking about, 3 more that are coming up, but take a minute here and look. With great power comes great responsibility. The nucleus has a lot of information, and it's got a lot of responsibility in cell division. The ribosomes, I should mention in passing, are often bound to another organelle, a larger structure called the rough ER. And then you don't need to know the word protein filaments, but understand that it is like a scaffolding. Cytoskeleton is like a scaffolding that holds up the cell's structure. Okay, 3 more organelles that eukaryotic cells have are the lysosome, the vacuoles, and the mitochondria. Lysosomes are the equivalent of the stomach. They ingest things the cell doesn't need and break them down. Vacuoles are like Tupperware. They hold things that the cell does need and wants to use later. And then the mitochondria, we've talked about ATP. The mitochondrion make that ATP accessible. So they break apart food energy and put them into ATP molecules that we learned about earlier. So I'm going to show you here what a typical eukaryotic animal cell looks like, and I want you to think about this in terms of differences because we're going to make some observations and then I'm going to compare it to a plant cell. But when you look at an animal cell, the cell membrane is fluid. In other words, look, there's no particular structure of this cell. It is a lot like, I keep saying, a water balloon because it is changeable in its surface. We have talked about these organelles, right? Cytoplasm, you can see how it fills its space in there. The lysosome is the stomach. Don't need to worry about these two. There's the nucleus, and inside the nucleus is where the DNA lives. The little blue dots you see are the ribosomes. You would see them also in everywhere else. These squiggly-looking, caterpillar-looking organelles are mitochondria. And I think that's all I have on this picture that we talked about. I want you to compare that to the plant cell. This is still a eukaryotic cell in that it still has a nucleus. You can see the nucleus right here. So there are still ribosomes. See the little blue dots? There are still mitochondrion. There are still vacuoles and lysosomes. There is a special vacuole in a plant cell. It's called the large central vacuole. I know it's a very original name. If you've ever seen a plant wilt because it needs to be watered, that's because the large central vacuole is emptying, and the cell walls aren't able to hold its structure without that internal pressure. Speaking of cell wall, that's what you see here, this rigid, very sturdy looking additional membrane. There is a membrane here underneath. The cell membrane is still there, but there's an additional protective layer called the cell wall. And then the last thing to talk about, which I'm sure you already know on some level, that plant cells have chloroplast. Plants are green. The chloroplasts have chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is green, and that's what makes plants green. And so that and the way that those things reject certain wavelengths of light. So we're going to talk about the chloroplast and the mitochondrion in a special part of this unit when we talk about energy. But those are the three things that are different in plant cells that are not in animal cells. The last thing to talk about is something called turgor pressure. So I talked to you about this in the last slide, but when you have a plant cell, and I can tell this is a plant cell because it has a rigid cell wall, when you have when the plant cell's central vacuole is lower in water, then the pressure against the inside of this structure isn't there. And you can see here that the plant can't support its own weight. You can tell if you're dehydrated because your cells have something similar without the central vacuole. But if you're dehydrated and you pinch some skin, if it stays there, then you probably need to go drink a bunch of water. But it basically works like this. Water leaves, and the pressure that's holding the structure together gets less, and then the atmospheric pressure is able to push inward on the cell until more water comes in to fill that back up. All right, so we've had two parts to this lesson. The main ideas are, can you apply the cell theory to explain how cells were discovered and categorized? There's three parts to the cell theory that you have to know, right? Consists of cells. All living things consist of cells. Cells come from existing cells, and in order to be considered alive, or cells are the basic unit. Basic unit, all things come from cells, and cells comes from cells. And then the basics of cell structure. So good luck. I will see you in the next lesson.